Good morning. We are on Mem Zayin Amud Aleph 47a. We're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines above the Mishnah. So if you look towards the bottom, there's a big bold Masnisan. So you count 9 lines top of that. That's where we are. The line begins with the word Havet Dachik, and the third word is Yeshua ben Prachia. The third, fourth, and fifth word, I should say. There's a line that says Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia above that. Yeah.
I can't find the Mishnah.
Mishnah's there.
Oh, okay.
So here, Yeshua ben Prachia. See it?
It's above the Rabbi.
Yeah, just above the Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia. There's Havet Dachik, and the third word is Yeshua ben Prachia. Okay, so this is the second story that the Mishnah cited to, that the Gemara cited to, quoting from a Brisa, which said that as a rule, a person should be sure that whilst they're pushing away with the left hand, they also bring forth with the right hand, and not to push away with two hands. The first example we gave was Elisha and his student Gehazi, which we discussed at length over the last few days. And the second story is Yeshua ben Prachia, and the way the Mishnah, the way the Brisa was quoted, it says, Ve'echad mitalmidav, and one of his students. As I mentioned in the gloss on the side, it tells us to change the words Echad mitalmidav, which means one of his students, to Yeshu HaNatzri, which means JC of Nazareth. Yes, Yeshu of Nazareth. And the reason why this would have been edited, as I mentioned, is because all printing was controlled for hundreds of years by the local authority, which would have been the Christians, Rome specifically. The early printings was the Cincino family, which is an Italian family. I don't think they were Jewish per se, but they made some deal with someone Jewish to print the Talmud. And in fact, most of the censorship didn't come from the Christians themselves, but the Jews self-censoring before they put it to publish in anticipation of what the Christians might find offensive and thus lead to pogroms, burnings, and who knows what. Now, the end is that we can never live up to their incredible censorship standards, and they still found reasons to burn, rape, pillage, murder, and whatnot. But as a rule, this is what we used to do. We used to self-censor. So thank God we live today in times where we have freedom of expression and we can criticize and what we want and who we want. And no one could say boo, which is wonderful. So you'll find often in printings of Rambam, of Gemara, where the printing will maintain the original falsified or censored printing version. And then on the side, the modern scholars will say, you should note that in such and such handwriting, it says it in X version. You know, there's an earlier handwriting that predates the printing. So the same thing is true over here. In the story of Yeshua ben Prachia, it identifies the student as Yeshu HaNatzri.
Didn't you mention earlier that Yeshua ben Prachia was one of the Zugoi?
That's right. So
that time frame, I mean, it seems. What's the time frame again between the?
Okay, so the question is where you put JC. So I mentioned this in the other class. Yeah. So I mentioned this in the other class, which I sent to you. I'm not going to repeat the whole story, but the short of it is essentially, yeah, it seems like you watched the class, yeah. So just the short of it is that if the Christians are correct in putting JC after the destruction of the Second Temple, then Yeshua ben Prachia is almost a century earlier. Because Yeshua ben Prachia is one of the Zugos, right? We have in the Mishnah the pairs of leaders, Shmaya and Avtalia and Hillel and Shammai. So you had Yeshua ben Prachia and Nitaya Harbeli. They're mentioned in Pirkei Avos as the Zugos, which would be during the Second Temple period. So it's almost a century before when they would have claimed JC would have been. So if their timeline is correct, then this is not JC. And either one of two things. Either at some point in history, they assumed it was JC, so they put in Yeshu of Nazareth, or there's another Yeshu of Nazareth. As I mentioned, Yeshu could stand for Yamach Shemoy V'Zichir, that his name be obliterated. So it could be somebody else who caused trouble. That's also possible. Or it's possible the Christian timeline is incorrect, and JC actually lived earlier, and then this is JC. So it's not exactly clear. right? What is clear, though, as I mentioned in that other video, is that during this time period, it is not uncommon for people to come along and claim to be a Messiah. Because even during the Second Temple period, the Jews are, for only for a very short period of time, are they truly independent. They're most of the time they're vassal kings. Right, first under Persia, who gives them permission to begin with to go back and build the Second Temple, but they're still paying tribute to Persia, right? And then when Persia falls to Greece under Alexander, Alexander marches on Jerusalem. He doesn't destroy Jerusalem because he's fascinated with the Jewish faith and philosophy. And we have all kinds of stories in the Gemara of Shimon HaTzadik going to meet Alexander, right? And then once, so after Alexander dies, sometime later, the story of CHANUKA happens, and there's a Hashmonaim rebellion. There's a brief period when the Hashmonaim retain true independence on Jerusalem, on Israel. And afterwards, it falls to the successors of the Greeks, which were when Alexander died, Greeks split up, and Israel was fought over by two different successors of Greece, either Egypt or the Ptolemies in Egypt, or the Persian Greeks, the Assyrian Greeks, which would have been to the west, to the east, either the east or the west. But Jerusalem wasn't independent. Then the story of Hanukkah happens. Then there's a brief period of independence, and then Rome takes charge. So during this period, especially during the Roman period, you have, especially as you get closer and closer to the end of the Second Temple, when corruption becomes more and more rampant, as we're going to see in a moment about that corruption. The Hashmonaim line was unfortunately very corrupt. The first generation of the Hashmonaim, the heroes of the Maccabees, but very, very soon after that, 2-3 generations later, and there's mass corruption. They're killing their own family members. The kind of corruption you find in like European kings, where there's like backstabbing within the family because they're trying to like maintain their line. The same kind of thing, unfortunately, goes down in the Hashmonaim line. We have incest, murder, bribery.
There's still a bit of Mikdash during that.
Yes.
So I guess that's what brings on the destruction.
That's correct. So you read that the destruction of the temple is brought on by the hatred of the Jewish people to each other. It's not just a mystical thing. Jews are hating each other, so God punished them. That's true, but it's also quite a literal thing because they couldn't get their act together.
Yeah.
And because of this corruption, the Kohanim were almost all corrupted too. So the Beis Hamikdash itself was corrupted, even though Jews, believing that this is Hashem's Beis Hamikdash, still serve God there, but the Beis Hamikdash leadership was corrupt. The high priest would bribe their way into being high priest by just paying off the local Romans. It was a disaster. So during this period, there's all kinds of people claiming to be like, I'm going to lead the Jews and get rid of these Romans and make an order. And a lot of disillusioned people who had complete lack of leadership turned to these kind of people. That's where JC became popular. But he was one of a dozen or more that did that kind of thing. But again, if we're putting the timeline correctly, then JC's after the Second Temple period. But it's not far-fetched to assume there were such kind of characters that existed before the Second Temple period. Because it's the same kind of...
Well, there's false messiahs.
That's correct. Okay, so Bar Kokhba wasn't necessarily a false messiah, but he was a failed messiah. It's a subtle distinction, and I give a whole class on that. Rambam discusses that, and I once gave a class on that Rambam. You can search it up on YouTube, where we discuss the difference between Bar Kokhba versus other false messiahs.
No,
right? Bar Kokhba was followed by Rabbi Akiva and many other scholars. Yeah, because they assumed he was going to restore the Third Temple. Why shouldn't he? He's a warrior. He's a firm Jew. He's an Orthodox Jew. He follows Torah law, and he's a successful warrior. Why shouldn't he be? He just got killed in the end. And he got killed because he messed up. He messed up in the end. He made a mistake, and he ended up getting killed for that. And the sages weren't necessarily against his being killed. At any rate, so this kind of gives you an idea of the chaos of that time period. And we're going to read in a moment part of that chaos. Okay, so Rabbi Shua ben Prachia, the story with Rabbi Shua ben Prachia, having pushed away a student and not giving him room to come back, pushing him away with two hands, Mahi. What is the story? The Gemara says, "Kedahava ka kotel Yanai Malka lerabanan." When Yanai the king was killing the sages were always a thorn in the thigh of the corrupt kingship, corrupt leadership. Because the sages, they were called. These timelines get messed up because where we are and what we're in, who's where and who's what. So I might be a little bit fuzzy in these descriptions here, but as a rule, meaning I might be wrong in terms of the exact timeline of where everybody is, but as a rule, the sages stayed away from politics, and they maintained their focus on spiritual life, ritual life, serving God, fulfilling halacha. And this became more and more true as the time went on, especially after the destruction of the Second Temple, where they made it their mission to codify and write down all of law in the Mishnah. But this was always their position. So it's a less so earlier. Later, they were called the Perushim, much later in time. After the Second Temple, they were called the Perushim. Perushim means the ones who were segregated, because they separated themselves from politics completely. Earlier, they weren't completely separated from politics. They were still quite invested, but nonetheless, they were the ones who were not afraid to speak truth to power. You had this earlier with the Hakel story, remember? With the Hakel story where the king, who was it? Was it the same Yanai? The guy who came to Hakel and he was crying, and the sages said, "Don't worry, you're our brother," right? Because he had a questionable lineage. Who was the king then? I think maybe it was the same Yanai. So the sages were like they maintained their independence from the corruption of politics. So they did involve themselves to some degree or another, but they still maintained that independence. And because of that, they were always a thorn in the king and the leadership's thigh, because they were wholesome leadership that people can look to, which would undermine their authority. Yeah? Right. So unfortunately, not uncommon that the Jewish king would kill the sages. This happens. King Saul did it. We have Yana here. The Gemara tells a story elsewhere, but the Gemara is referring to that here. We had also Hordes did that, except for Bab ben Butta, he kept him alive, right? He blinded him. That whole story. So this is an unfortunate thing where the kings are killing the sages, because the sages are like a leadership that stays independent in them, so they're the biggest threat. Yeah. So it says the Gemara, when Yanai, the king, was busy killing the sages during that period, Shimon ben Shetach, who is Jewish leadership at the time, he wasn't the Nasi. Yeshua ben Prachi was the Nasi at the time. All right, where is it, Rashi? Where is that Rashi? Sorry? No, Shimon ben Shetach was. Where is that Rashi? I think Shimon ben Prachi was the Nasi. Okay, let's see. So Shimon ben Shetach was one of the leaders of the Jewish people. Amtinu Achse, the sister of Yanai, who was Shimon ben Shetach's, the wife of Yanai was Shimon ben Shetach's sister. So Shimon ben Shetach was actually brother-in-law to the king, to Yanai. And she hid her brother from her husband.
From her husband?
Sorry? Yeah, from her husband.
Oh, right.
Her husband is Yanai the king. And this is, he's a sage. Yeah. And this is Shimon ben Shetach's sister. So she's hiding him. Now, Rabbi Shua ben Prachia didn't have such protexia, didn't have such kind of connections. So Azal Arak Alexandria, Shel Mitzrayim, he went running off to hide in Alexandria of Egypt. That was the capital of Egypt at the time. So Rabbi Shua ben Prachia ran away. Kihava Shalma, when there was finally peace made, and Yanai stopped killing the sages. Shalach le Shimon ben Shetach. Shimon ben Shetach sent a message to Rabbi Shua ben Prachia to inform him that all is safe, you can come back. And the message read as follows: Minei Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, from me, Jerusalem, this holy city. Lacha, to you, Alexandria Shemitzrayim, Alexandria of Egypt. Achoisi, my sister, meaning you are my sister, you Shimon ben Shetach from Alexandria, my sister. He refers to himself, from me, Jerusalem, holy city, that's Yeshua ben Prachia. Sorry, Shimon ben Shetach. To you, Alexandria of Mitzrayim, my sister, Yeshua ben Prachia. Bali Shardei B'Soichech, my husband dwells within you. My husband, meaning the husband of Jerusalem, meaning you, Rabbi Shua ben Prachia, you're the husband of Jerusalem because you were the head of the Sanhedrin. He was the Nasi. He was the Nasi. The Nasi was like the Nasi's translated as president, which is like the absolute leader of the Jewish people, including both political and religious. This position of Nasi lasted way after the Second Temple was destroyed, all the way into Babylonia. You had Nasi. Rabbi Yehuda is called Buddha Nasi, and then you had in Babylonia the Nasi, which is like not necessarily.
It's kind of like an exilarch.
No, 1 second. Yes, the Nasi later became exilarch. No, you're right. In Babylonia, they were called the Nasi was the exilarch. Earlier, the Nasi was there's the Nasi, right? The Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, and the Rosh of Bezdin was the second in command of the Sanhedrin, right?
I think so, yeah.
Right. So then you'd be right that he would have been the head of the Sanhedrin. Is that right? Let's see if there's something more on the Rashi on the side. No. So my husband, says Jerusalem to Alexandria, my husband dwells within you. My husband referring to Rabbi Shimon ben Prachia, who's the Nasi. Vani and I, says Jerusalem, Yesheva Shemama, I sit desolate. That was the message. The message that Yeshua and Prachia received was Jerusalem sending a message to Alexandria. My husband, meaning you, Yeshua and Prachia, sits in you, Alexandria, and I, Jerusalem, sit desolate. Okay, so Yeshua and Prachia said to himself, Shema Mina, I can deduce from here, Havalei Shalma, that there is peace in the world. So he starts to head back to Jerusalem, and he's going with his students. So he ran away with the students. He's coming back with the students. Is the Steinsaltz Sotah here? If it's here, let's have a look, see if he has the background on these people. Okay.
37A.
Yeah, maybe anything on the background there? Next page.
Personalities.
Yes, still 40.
Okay, Alexandria of Egypt.
Here, this peg is the. So here it discusses that question of when they lived, right? Of when JC lived.
Right.
Here's the background. Here, I want to read this. Here, let me read this one.
Mm-hmm.
King Yana, the king, killing the sages. And I want to read. It doesn't have anything on Shimon ben Shetach. Let's read Steinsaltz's note on King Yana was killing the sages. King Yana, who tended, as did his father, toward the camp of the Sadducees. The Sadducees were those, the corrupt Jewish leaders were primarily the Sadducees. They were those who did not believe in the oral tradition of Torah. They believed just in the interpretation of the strict written rule out any interpretation of the sages of the oral tradition, and they were very much in bed with the Romans.
They were very zealot.
They had more zealots, less zealots, but they were in bed with the Romans, most of these guys. Okay, so he leaned towards the camps of the Sadducees, and he had an open break with the sages after his defeat in the battle with Nabateans. According to Josephus, Josephus being a Jewish historian, we'll leave his character alone for now. The split was deepened after he refused to perform the ritual of the water libation in the temple. Right, pouring the water on Sukkos is a matter of oral tradition. It doesn't say anywhere explicitly in the Torah to pour water on the altar during Sukkos. So this was a big split. They knew the high priest was with the sages or not with the sages if they pour the water. Right? There's a famous story. They would make the priest lift up his tunic so that they can see the water going down into the temple and not be pouring it somewhere on the side. Yeah. There's one guy pelted with a surgeon because he poured it on the floor instead of down the hole as he's supposed to. Okay. So this was there you go. He was then pelted with a surgeon from the crowd that was present there. And he is in his army. He had his army kill those who were in the temple. This led to a civil war lasting several years. After Yana was victorious in this war, he killed many of his opponents, including many of the leaders of the Pharisees being the sages, Pharisees being the Perushim, those who separated. That's the name I mentioned earlier. Several of those leaders, Rabbi Shua and Prachia amongst them, escaped to outside Eretz Yisrael, while others amongst them, Rabbi Shimon ben Shetach, hid within Eretz Yisrael. Although there was a period of calm in the later years of Anna's reign, it seems that only after his death, when control had passed into the hands of the Pharisees, back to the sages, that all the sages returned to Eretz Yisrael.
Pharisees are
the sages. Pharisees is English for Perushim, those who separate themselves. They remove themselves from most political life. They remove themselves from the whole game of bribing the Romans, fighting the Romans. They remove themselves from the whole question. You had many Jews trying to bribe the Romans, some trying to keep the peace, some getting in bed with them, and some trying to rebel against them, whereas the sages stayed away from all of that and just said, we're going to focus on learning and Torah observance. Okay, so it doesn't give us any background on Shimon ben Shetach and Yeshua ben Prachia themselves.
There's an index in the back. Yeah.
Anyway.
Personality.
Yeah. Okay, let's go forward in the story. So, Ki Asa, as Yeshua ben Prachia is traveling back to Jerusalem, Yeshua ben Prachia with his students are traveling back to Jerusalem after he hears from Shimon ben Shetach that things are calmed down. He stayed at a certain inn. Kamkamayu Bikare. The innkeeper stood before him with great glory, with great honor. Shaper Avile Yikratova. He treated him well with good honor. The Gemara repeats that phrase twice. Stood before him with great honor, and he treated him well with good honor. So Yosef, Rabbi Yeshua and Prachia was sitting, and he was praising. Kama noach san yazu. How nice is this host? How nice is this place? Amar le echad mitalmidov. So one of his students said, either Yeshua Natsri or not. One of his students told Rabbi Yeshua and Prachia, Rabbi, my teacher, ein now trudos, the eyes of the trutos, the eyes of the hostess, the wife of the host, the innkeeper, are round. They're round eyes.
The other one was narrow eyes.
When did we have narrow eyes? Actually, it says agulis. When did we have narrow?
Reading narrow.
Yeah? Trutos Rashi translates as round. Right? Back here again. Yeah, he goes to the history of the word turtas and concludes that it means narrow. Rashi says agulos. Each translates as narrow. Rashi writes agulos, which means round. Now, it could be
almond shaped.
See, it could be that what the student means is not just to comment on her physical appearance, but to comment on the fact that maybe she looks stressed. He's commenting on her eyes. It doesn't necessarily mean that he meant her physical appearance. Rather, like her eyes look tired. They look narrow as in they're stressed out. That's possible what he means. Right? But Rabbi Yeshua and Prachia does not understand it that way. So Rabbi Yeshua and Prachia does not understand it as a positive thing. Amar le, So Rabbi Shimon Prachia tells the students, Rasha, you wicked one. This is what you're busy with, looking at the appearance of a woman. This is what you're busy with. Apik arba mea shfuri. He took out 400 shofars. Vishamte and excommunicated him. As a rule, over a certain number, the Gemara means to exaggerate and say it was a lot. But obviously, if the Gemara says 400, there's something significant about the number 400. Does it mean literally he took out 400 shofars? Probably not. But the fact that the Gemara uses that number means there's some sort of significance. I don't know what it is, just throwing that out there. Kol Yoima, every day, Asalakame, the student came back to Yeshua ben Prachia, trying to gain his way back into the fold. V'loi kibli, and Yeshua ben Prachia would not take him back. Yom Chad, one day, have a kakarish kriya shema. Have a kakarish shema. Rabbi Shimon Prachia was reading Shema. Asalakame, and the student came before him. Have a b'daitel kubule. And actually, at this time, Rabbi Shimon Prachia was actually thinking to accept it. And achvale biyadei, he motioned to him with his hand. He meant, hold on a sec. Let me finish Shema and I'll take you back. But Savar, the student interpreted it, matche dochele, that he's being pushed away. And that was the last straw that broke the camel's back. Yeah. So Ozal, he left. Zokaf, lebinta, and palcha. He erected like a stone and bowed down to it. That was it. I'm out. So Amalei, after he finished Shema, Rabbi Shimon Prachia turned to his Zakuf Levinti. Levinti means like a brick. He established a brick palcha and he worshipped it. Amalei, so Rabbi Shimon Prachia told the student, Chazarbach, return. I'm taking you back. Amalei, the student said back to his teacher, I'm sorry, too late. So I learned from you. Anyone who sins, and causes others to sin, in my speaking teshuvah is not granted opportunity to do teshuvah. The Amar Mar, for master said, it has been stated elsewhere in understanding what the student meant when he said that I made others sin and therefore I have no room to return. So it's been stated, Kishif, Vehisis, Vediach, this student, Yeshu or not, used, Kishif means sorcery, and using sorcery, he would play all kinds of tricks and cause Jews to leave Judaism by performing these pseudo miracles. And the Hichtias Yisrael caused Jews to sin. So, concluding statement. This is the end of the story. About what? Certainly. Yeah. So if this is indeed JC, what's interesting is that the Gemara is not saying that this is that the miracles didn't happen. If this is indeed JC, and it's not either claiming he doesn't have spiritual powers. They're just impure spiritual powers.
A lot of people did back then, no?
So it seems. So that's the point. That's where I'm going, which is that just because something is spiritually attractive doesn't make it good or holy or godly. In the same way you have in the physical world, you have eating. And eating is an inborn desire that humans have to eat. And this is good because otherwise we wouldn't survive. Someone who doesn't have the inborn desire to eat is a problem, right? So you're attracted to eat. And not all food that you're attracted to is good for you. Not physically, some food is very unhealthy, and not spiritually, some food's not kosher. Right? So just because you're drawn to something doesn't make it in of itself good. Right? We're drawn to eat, and it's either good or bad. And the same thing is true of spiritual attraction. We're born as humans with a soul, which is in the image of God. So this is not just a Jewish soul, but a human soul, period. And as such, we're attracted to spirituality. We're attracted to meaning and purpose in life. And just because something fulfills that doesn't mean it's good for you. In the same way, we're attracted to food, but not all food is good and healthy for you. So we're attracted to spirituality. Sorry?
Both physically and spiritually.
Correct. And it's not as if all spiritual is godly and good. No, there's spiritual negativity too. And in the temple times, when the world as a whole was more spiritually inclined, you had more heightened Jewish spirituality, godly spirituality, and you had more heightened klipa, negative spirituality. Which explains why, even though the temple was standing, you had people running off to idols down the street, especially in the first temple period, where you had miracles happening in the temple right here, and people running off to the Baal down the block. What are you doing? You don't see a miracle happening here? You know what the Jew said? So what? I see a miracle there too. Just like you ask a Jew, why are you eating non-kosher food here? There's kosher food down the street. He says, yeah, but I like this one better. The same thing is true, just up on a spiritual level. There's spirituality right here in the temple. Yeah, but I like that spirituality better.
It's usually just the easiest one.
It's exactly right. The difference between klipa and kedusha is always going to be the easier one is going to be the one that's not kedusha. The one that tempts you more, the one that inflates your ego a little bit more. Kedusha you got to fight for with a little humility. Exactly right. When it comes to klipa, it's more sonjing to the ego. It makes us feel better about ourselves.
Instant gratification.
That's correct. And that's the story with what the Gemara is telling us here about this student. Not that he didn't do miracles, he did, but he was using powers of spiritual impurity, which is an important reminder. Just because we find something spiritually enlightening does not make it good. It doesn't mean it's not spiritually enlightening. It is, but it's klipa. This is especially important as we interact with Jews who are attracted to all kinds of spirituality in the East, because they're spiritually very hungry. And if they're not provided a good menu of wholesome spirituality, they're going to look for the unwholesome spirituality. Like a kid who's not trained to eat healthy kosher food, eats non-healthy unkosher food. And if we're not trained to eat a healthy spiritual diet, we're going to take an unhealthy spiritual diet. And that's what this student did.
Is it possible also that because you have that whole discussion with, is it JC, is it not JC?
Yeah.
Maybe it's just irrelevant because JC could have been any monkey who did a few tricks and then people followed.
Exactly right.
It could have been 1 out of a million.
And it seems like it was, that's right. And it seems like in this period, it was quite common. Again, because Jews were starving for leadership.
Because if we paid it too much attention, then we'd make it a bigger deal than it actually is. It's just
true.
One guy who people followed him, and that's it.
Yeah, that's correct. People were hungry for this kind of spirit, for this kind of leadership. On the one hand, you have corrupt leadership. On the other hand, you have the sages who are being hunted down and killed. So where are you turning as a simple folk? You're a simple farmer trying to live your life as a good Jew. Where do you go for hope? Where do you go for leadership? You look to the sages, they're being hunted down and killed and hiding. You look to the Sadducees as corruption. Where do you go? People were starving for leadership at this time. And it was ripe for all kinds of charlatans. So, concluding line from the Gemara, which requires a farbrengen in and of itself. So this whole thing started because the Gemara was discussing this idea that a person should not push away with 2 hands, but rather one push away and one bring in, right? Simultaneously, as you create boundaries with discipline, you also have to express love and bring it in. So this is the second example of such a story. So the Gemara concludes with the following comment on that regard. Tanya, we learned. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Rabbi Shimon son of Elazar says, Yetzer, one's evil inclination, or it doesn't say the word evil, one's inclination, one's desires, specifically, desire, as Rashi puts it, desire for lust, tinuk, a child, the isha, and one's wife, all 3 of those, te small doicha, the left push away, the yamim mikareves, and the right hand put in. Okay, so with children, it's easy. We discussed this easy. It's easier to understand. We discussed this earlier. You're educating a child, and you have to discipline. You can't just be all discipline without pushing the kid into a corner to the point that the kid has no chance of redemption. He's going to dump you and run away. Not now. I'll do it later. So there's got to be room for redemption even as you discipline. There's got to be love even as we discipline the right and the left. Same thing with one interaction with one wife.
Inclination also.
Sorry? Yes, that's the interesting part. So with one's wife as well, there has to be, it can't be either extreme. It can't be only love with no boundaries, It's not respectful of yourself, not respectful of your wife if there's no boundaries. Boundaries in the sense of like, you don't look when you're not supposed to look. You don't say what you're not supposed to say. Right? You don't demand what you're not supposed to demand. It's not just only love, love, love. Right? There's a lot of times. It's a funny thing. Guy, he's feeling his affinity towards his wife, but then she starts talking, and in his head he's like, "Oh, don't ruin what I love about you." It's like, do you love her or not? No, but she can't change who she is, right? Because that's love without respect. That's the right side without the left. It's a love without respect for who she is as an independent person. Can't just be expressing love. There's got to be boundaries also, right? And at the same time, it can't be only boundaries without any expression of any love. That's just a dry, cold relationship. So it's got to be both, the right and the left. There's the boundaries and there's the love. And the same thing is true of our own yates, our own desires. You can't deny your human desires. No, I'm not giving to urges ever. You're not giving into urges ever? What are you, stopping to be human? You can't do that. So you have boundaries on your desires, but it also has its outlet. It's a healthy outlet. One gets married, the wife goes to mikveh, there's a proper way to engage. But it's not as if we're like, deny our humanity and say, oh, no lust for me. And at the same time, we don't say just indulge all lust. So it's got to be right hand, bring forward, embrace my lust. At the same time, there's a discipline. There's a left hand that pushes away and says, here are the boundaries. And so it's the love within boundaries. It's the combination of love and respect. Not all respect, which would be just boundaries without any love, and not all love without any boundaries. This is internally true with our children and with our spouses. And with that, the Gemara concludes its detour, and we come back tomorrow, God willing, to the Egla Arufa, which is the main subject of this chapter of Sotah. Have a wonderful day, Yidden.